a viewer of the channel. Thank you all for viewing and subscribing and all that fun stuff and commenting. It makes the place a lot more fun than if it was just me. But a viewer brought in two Dr. Z Route 66s, a limited edition or anniversary edition and a standard one. He wants them gone through, made sure that they're the same, made sure that they're healthy, bias for some new tubes he got, KT66s, change out some spring retainers for some bear traps, etc., and add master volumes to these. Other than that, we're not going to be changing anything, hopefully. But let's take a look inside and see what we got. Nice and simple. IC connector, 3 amp fuse, 4 ohm, 8 ohm, 16 ohm taps. This must be the anniversary one. 15 years there. 15th anniversary, yeah. So preamp tube, second preamp tube. That's just one inside, that's all you get. Two big old KT66s with these spring retainers that damage the glass. So that's why we're going to put some bear traps in here. Filter cap and rectifier tube. Looks like a 5U4. Let's get this open and see what's waiting inside. Looks to be in really good shape. Yeah, I know I show this in a lot of videos, but not everyone sees all the videos. So hopefully, if people just see one of these, and I included this in as many as necessary, they'll get the idea. Don't use a number 2 screwdriver to handle number 3 screws. Just choose up the screw. All right, everything inside looks good, and we'll get to that. The first thing I like to do with any Dr. Z is just make sure the hardware is tight. All the preamp grounds are made to this input jack, and it was not tight. It does have a toothed washer, which is kind of rare for Dr. Z's in my experience. These output jacks do not. The 16 is tight. 8 was tight. 4 is tight. The owner says he never uses the 4 ohm tap. That's probably where we'll put a master volume pot, because I can do that non-destructively. It can always be put back the way it was. Everything in here with the original factory connections is painted red. So I could remove this jack and heat shrink the whole thing and just kind of tape it to one of the wires going to the 8 and 16, so it's still physically in the amp, not connected to anything. And that could be put back without disturbing any red paint, should that be necessary. Let's check the 3 amp fuse there. Make sure it is a 3 amp. And it is. So far everything's looking really good. Screw over here with a nut that has a bunch of other grounds off the power transformer secondary, and the IC jack, which is, not code, but it'd probably be okay. Make sure that's tight. It's a Kep's nut. It's the next size up from that. So rather than fish out the correct socket, we'll just try it with this. Now that's good and solid. Looking good, Lewis. So I'm going to go through everything in here and test it with tubes and all that stuff and see if there are any problems I notice. I'm going to make sure the bias is correct, make sure all the pots are clean, and then make a note of everything that's in here, because he wants the other amp. He wants the 2 amps to match, and if one of them has a slightly different circuit, if one of them is better than the other, etc., no big deal. I'm going to do all that before I even look at adding a master volume. And the issue with making changes to these amps, the Dr. Z's, has been misunderstood in some of my previous videos. They use solid core wire, which can make it very difficult to lift boards out of the way if I need to change a filter cap beneath the board. And the leads are wrapped multiple times around the turrets, which are fine until something needs to be changed. But once that happens, it can be kind of messy. It's beyond mil spec. Mil spec would be a 270-degree wrap, not a full wrap. These will all be 360, if not multiple times around. It's one thing to build it once. It's another thing for it to be serviced well repeatedly in the future. But pending a further inspection and playing it, won't know what's really going on from this point. But nothing stands out as it is now as being bad. I'll make sure that the power and standby switches are tight. That's also something that's not always the case. They feel nice and tight. So I'll make sure all this stuff is good. Anyway, just kind of behind the scenes stuff people don't think about as being amp repair. A lot of what I do is really boring little ticky-tacky stuff that adds up and makes a big difference. Well, I drew out the schematic of the first one. This is not the prettiest one to read, but it tells me what I need to know. The tone stack's pretty unusual in this. This is not the best way to draw how it should be, but this is just a first draft. But it's a pretty standard thing. Pintoed, very similar to the Vox. Unique tone stack, makes sense to me. Very little loading on the previous stage. High impedance, so it should really have a lot of gain to it. Fairly standard Vox style phase inverter, then feeding the output section, which again is pretty standard. A couple of deviations in this amp. The first amp and the second, I'll get into in just a minute. Just drawing things out for myself here. No big deal. This is the second one, as you can see, and almost everything inside it is the same. You'll notice these big 10-watt resistors here. These are 1 ohms from cathode to ground. They're factory, according to the paint on their kind of ugly solder joints, but they're solid enough. No one will really notice them. They're just there for measuring the bias. The newer one, the anniversary model, doesn't have it. Not really worth redoing. These are unlikely to ever fail. 10-watt, big block resistors like that. Lots of air around them. No issue. It's not going to throw off the behavior. Down at this end, there are a few minor changes. The newer one has got a dual 22 here, so 44, where this one's got a single 40. And this amp has an additional 22 in parallel with the first the first filter node. So the newer one has just got 50, 50, 44. This one has got 72, 50, 40. I'm not sure why they did that. They changed their minds on later ones, but this is factory red paint. I've redrawn the basics of the power supply here because here's an important point. They have the standby switch between the rectifier tube and the first reservoir cap. In the anniversary, it's just a 50 microfarad stage. In the earlier one, or the other one, I should say, it's got a 50 microfarad in parallel with a 22. That's problematic for 2 reasons. First of all, that means at the moment that you flip that standby, this cap initially appears as a full short, big power surge that can kill a rectifier tube. Second thing that is the 5U4GB is rated for a max of 40 microfarad. Here on the anniversary, it's got 50, but on the other one, it's got 72. So 50 is a little bit more than 40, but 72 is almost twice as much. So I'm definitely going to remove that 22 microfarad from the one that has it and just leave it at 50. Second of all, it's very important that the standby switch be after the first reservoir cap, the first filter cap in an amp. That way you don't have that current shock on the 5U4GB. So I need to move the filter cap over here, remove it here, but I'll leave the output transformer center tap connection on this side of the standby. So the standby will still function. And that takes all kinds of stress off the standby switch, takes all kinds of stress off the 5U4GB, and 50 is a lot closer to 40, and that's a mismatch you'll often get away with. Mesa will often use way too much capacitance on theirs. They'll have a dual rectifier or a triple rectifier, and that's great as far as the current of the two, but the capacitance, they still don't like having too much capacitance. It's a fun thing. But this circuit is very similar to, now that the schematic I've drawn is all nice and sloppy, that's actually very similar to what you'd find in a super reverb, and that standby switch tends to work just fine, and super reverbs have a time-tested design. So this change and getting rid of that excess filtering will make the amp behave better, last longer, have less stress on your output, on the rectifier tubes, and no sonic difference or performative difference as far as the owner is concerned. So it's a no-brainer. So the other difference on this one, this is not factory. Here we have an added resistor across this resistor in the bias supply. That's the only fundamental real difference between the two amps. This amp came in with 6L6s. The other one has these KT66s, and the owner provided more KT66s for this amp. So I imagine that once this resistor is removed, the stock bias supply will again be suitable for KT66s. And 1.5Ks, 470 ohms there, pretty standard stuff for KT66s or 6L6s. No big deal. So this is a very loud amp without the master volume, and it's late at night. So while I'm going to do some testing right now just to confirm both amps are working okay, I'm not going to be playing this in this video, and the tone stack is unusual. I can read the schematic and know pretty much what's going on, but I want to learn this amp before I offer any opinions on it. So I'm going to play it at full volume tomorrow and get a sense for how the amp behaves and feels. Before I make any changes to the amp, I want to know it as a player, not just as a tech and a designer. So, first, do no harm. I suspect these are both already really good amps. They need some little bits of TLC to make them both sound how they were when they were built, but nothing in here seems egregious or problematic. Oh, one other thing on this amp I meant to mention. Down here where these resistors go to ground at the chassis, this screw and nut were totally loose, so this amp would have had a lot of problems. I have not powered it on, so, I'm not going to loosen that just to replicate the problems, but it's really nice to have a good ground reference for your output tubes for the cathodes. So that's nice and tight and clean now. This amp should be sounding better already than it was before. Aside from putting KT66s in this amp and biasing both amps correctly to about the same position, I don't anticipate having to do much in this other than just make sure they're really great examples of how they were designed and, playing around with some master volume options over the next day or two. So stay tuned.